a relationship. Okay, so I'm going to read this, and then we'll do the student work together. We'll read chapter 31. So as we left off yesterday, we noticed that John 20, 30, 31 kind of sounds like the end of the gospel, but it's not. Now, there are scholars who think that that was the original end of the gospel, that John or someone else added chapter 35. I think it's possible that John added it. I don't think it's possible that anybody else added this chapter. But I think maybe after he had written that, he was like, "Oh, I need to tell him about Peter." So you'll see the end of the gospel sounds like the end of the gospel. Whereas the longer version of Mark, this is a little tidbit I didn't give to the other class. There's a longer ending to Mark that isn't in some of the earliest manuscripts. It probably was added to the scriptures, to the Gospel of Mark, and it sounds completely different from Mark. So it's pretty obvious. Okay, here we go. Peter and the other disciples were. Oh, I need to tell you first of all. I think that the book is being really harsh on Peter and the disciples. So we'll talk about that as we go through. Peter and the other disciples were getting restless. Peter, ever impatient and impulsive, was itching to do something. Just sitting around was getting to him. He had to act. "I'm going fishing," he suddenly declared. The other 6 disciples who were with him, we know that Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John were there, but the other 2 disciples are not named for us. Readily agreed. "We're going with you." On the surface, this incident seems quite normal for men who were used to being active. Just sitting around with nothing specific or purposeful to do soon would get to any active person. But think about it for a moment. When Christ had first called Peter, James, and John from their fishing nets to become fishers of men, he was asking them to give up everything to serve him. Yet Peter and the others turn around here and go fishing again. Did you ever wonder where they got the boat and equipment to go fishing at this point? Did they charter the boat from someone? Did they have to go out and buy or borrow fishing nets? Hadn't they gotten rid of their boats and equipment when they stopped fishing to follow Christ? What they're going to say in a minute is they saved it. They saved that stuff as a backup plan. That's not necessarily true. When James and John were called, they left Zebedee, their dad, in the boat. He was a fisherman. That's the way men grew up and became what their fathers were. After a certain period of time in school, they'd be like, "Hey, now go learn the family trade." That's what Jesus was doing before his ministry. He was a carpenter before his ministry. His father was a carpenter. So I don't think it's necessary that they've hung on to this stuff as a backup plan. And I don't think they did. And even if they were going fishing, is that to say that if you decide, Sage and Brecken and Liv, and you decide to go shoot some hoops for a while, before you go to work or whatever, that you're shirking your other duties? Probably not, unless you're actually doing it when you're supposed to be at work, right? And you called in sick. That's not the case here. So apparently not. They hadn't sold them. They held on to the equipment from their old profession when they began to follow Christ. There is no proof of that. They're taking, "I'm going fishing," and they're creating a story. That's, to me, it's a strong word. That's irresponsible. Did they think that his call, Jesus' call, was only temporary, or did they think that perhaps following him was too risky if that pursuit failed? They could always return to their former profession. We don't really know what went through their minds, but we do know that they still had their equipment and returned very easily and quickly to their old profession. We don't know that. Contrast these disciples, maybe never owned their own equipment because their fathers owned it. Who knows? Contrast these disciples' situation with the account of Elisha's response when Elijah called him in 1 Kings 19. Elisha was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in a field when Elijah found him and cast his mantle on him. Can you picture 12 yoke of oxen, meaning 12 oxen? Controlling so many beasts must have been a daunting task. But Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah. After speaking to the old prophet briefly, he then returned to the oxen, slew them, killed them, and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen. We might say that he was burning his bridges behind him, so he couldn't go back. He was leaving no opportunity for himself to go back from following the call of God upon his life. Unlike the disciples who apparently kept all of their fishing gear in storage just in case, Elisha destroyed everything that might tempt him to go back on his call. Returning our attention to the disciples, however, we nowhere see mention that Peter and the others ever prayed about what they were about to do. Again, I think this is harsh and I think it's speculative. They never asked God's blessings on it. They just did it, following the impulsiveness of Peter. Now, there was nothing wrong with fishing. It is an honorable profession, a good job, if that's what God has called them to do. But he had given them a new mission. Were they now backing out of the mission to return to their old ways? The result was failure. They fished all night without so much as a nibble. Jesus told them earlier, "Without me you can do nothing." But they had quickly forgotten. Only later, when they obeyed the instructions of Jesus to cast the net on the other side of the boat, did they catch any fish. Only when they followed Christ would he give them success for their labors. How often are we like those disciples? We recognize and answered. We have recognized and answered God's call upon our lives, but then some setback or disappointment causes us to look with longing eyes for the good old days. And we are tempted to return to what we were doing before he called us, rather than waiting on his instructions and seeking. He is seeking his will for our actions. We jump back to our past activities and struggle to be successful in our own strength. But God has not promised to bless what we do ourselves, but only what he does through us. When Christ called to the fishermen from the shore, "Children, do you have any fish?" He was essentially calling them boys. Actually, it was a loving term. It was an affectionate term. And his question was prodding their consciences with the fact that despite all of their night's efforts, they didn't have anything edible to show for it. When we work in our own strength, we will return home empty-handed with no lasting results from our labors. Christ-directed service, however, always brings results. So the top picture is the Sea of Galilee, on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, which is where they would have been fishing in Galilee. And that picture is a fish that is commonly found in that part of the sea, and it might be the kind of fish that they ended up catching. Can't know that for sure. Green concluded, when we obey the Lord and seek his will for our lives, we will be successful in the undertaking he assigns us to do. Wherever he leads, if we follow his leadership and trust him for the outcome, we can count on blessings and outstanding results. Success in God's ministry is not determined by eloquence, education, or dynamic personality, but by the power of God in the life of the believer. May each of us be willing to surrender all for the high calling of God in Christ Jesus, and never to return to the former ways when we were forced to wait for further instruction. So we're going to begin by reading John 21, and then we will answer some of the questions, not all of the questions, in your book, and then you'll be done with that part of the book, with the student work part of the book. So we're in John 21. After this means after the resurrection, after the appearance to the disciples, after the appearance to Mary, after the appearance to Thomas. This happened. How long after, we don't know. Sometime between his resurrection and his ascension. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee. And he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and gotten into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? They answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net on the other side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were able to haul it in they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the full net of fish, for they were not far from the land, about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net full of fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus had revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to them, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. Jesus said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Jesus said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, following them. And John was the one who also had leaned back against him, or against Jesus, during the Last Supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple would not die, yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple, John's talking about himself now, who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, there were also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And that's the end of John. So let's answer some of these questions. Yes?
Why is Thomas called?
Apparently he had a twin, and that's why he was called the twin. I don't think the twin was one of the disciples. I know my nephews hate it when we refer to them as the twins. They're, two individuals. Might be something. Okay, so why do you think Peter decided to go fishing between Jesus' appearances to the disciples? no right or wrong answer. We don't know. Processing, kind of like coping, maybe a coping mechanism, a way to process. I don't know if any of you are fishermen or women. I don't get it myself. This is the only thing I like to do in fishing. I'm not touching a worm. I'm not touching a big fish. I certainly don't want it to swallow my hook because I ain't taking that thing out of there even if it's in its lip. I was done with fishing the first time I ever fished, and I pulled in a fish and it had a hook in his eye. And I'm like, that's it. I'm done. I mean, I was like probably 8 years old, 9 years old, and I dropped it and I ran. I was like, I'm not doing this. But maybe as a way to de-stress, maybe as a pastime. It says nothing about them going back to fishing as a vocation. We won't answer the second one. Why do you think Peter was saddened that Jesus asked him if he loved him 3 times? Yeah.
Because, like, he probably was just sad that he had to ask that.
Yeah, don't you know? You know, to be like with your parents or me with my husband, you know, do you love me? Yeah, I do. Do you really love me? Yeah, and eventually you just be, yeah, I love you. Why can't that sink in, right? So, yeah, it may have been hard for him. Like, why do you feel like you need to ask me 2 times? I told you I love you. No, I don't think that Peter maybe was necessarily cognizant of this, but how many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. And we'll talk about this in the lecture, but it might have reminded Peter of his denials, and that might have made him sad. But I think Jesus was giving him the opportunity to erase those denials, to profess his love through his tongue. Next question. Why do you think Peter was interested in what would happen to the disciple Jesus loved, John? Now listen, I need to tell you this. So when Jesus says, when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, that's a euphemism for crucifixion. That's why it says he's telling Peter how he's going to die. So literally, he's saying to Peter, you're going to be crucified for me because you're a follower of Christ. Now that's a really hard thing to hear, right? Nobody wants to hear that. And I don't think anyone really wants to know how they're going to die. But I know there are 2 ways I don't want to die: fire and drowning. But I don't think any of us really want it. And here Peter is getting this information. I don't know if you know about this website, but there's this website that you can plug in some information about yourself, and it'll tell you the day you're going to die. Ain't no way I'm getting on that thing. I do not want to know, and it's probably going to say next Thursday. So I don't want to know that information. And I don't think Peter wanted to know this information, right? So they're walking along the beach, and Peter has gotten this information. He's looking around. He's like, what about him? What's going to happen to him? Does he have a fate like mine? So I think he was probably disturbed by what he's just heard. But he may have also thought, especially when Jesus said, if I let him remain until I come back, what's that to you? And he might have thought that John was his favorite, Or he might have thought, are we going to go through this together? Are we going to have this rough road to go through together? John and me. This next question is a little bit tough. Do you think it's fair that some believers are persecuted for their faith while others seem to have an easy road? Life's not fair. My nephew used to say, right? Something's unfair. Probably not, but God has something for each of us. And what does the Bible say will come to everyone who believes? Trials, persecutions. Jesus was honest about that. And that will come. And listen, I mean, the world is getting crazier by the minute. I don't know if y'all know this, but stuff's going on that's just kind of unheard of. And there are people in this country that are becoming more and more antithetical, particularly to evangelical Christians. And I don't know when it's going to happen, but I know at some point there will be persecution in our country as well. And I've often been convicted by if my Bible is taken, my Bibles are taken from me, how much of the Bible will I remember? Years ago when my grandmother died, she died in a nursing home. My mother was out of town. It was my mother's mother. And I went with my dad to go out there. And we had to call my mom. She was in New Jersey. And they took us to a room. This is 1989, so no cell phones. So they took us to a room that had a phone so that we could call my mom. And it was on the Alzheimer's ward. It was late. And it was dark. But the room across from the room where the phone was, the door was ajar. It was pitch black inside. And I heard an old man with dementia saying, "The Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name." And he went on to quote all of Psalm 8. And I remember thinking, as a very young woman, in her 20s, I remember thinking, I want to know Scripture so well that when I have to know that I'm in a nursing home, I will need to read the Bible. I'll have it. I'll know it so well. And one of the reasons, not that you're looking forward to having dementia in a nursing home, but one of the reasons I have you memorize passages and not separate verses is that I hope many years from now, if you're in a rough time or if something you're having a difficult situation, that you'll remember in the beginning was the Lord, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And that you'll remember, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. And if the time comes that we no longer can have our Bibles, so is fairness what we all deserve? Yeah. We're all dirty, rotten sinners deserving hell. But God in His mercy not only gives us His grace, but also walks with us in our difficult times. Paul had a night in prison that was particularly difficult, and when he wrote about it, he said, Jesus came and stood right by me. I don't know what that experience actually looked like, but I know that he knew that Christ was with him, and He is with us in the darkest times of our lives as well. Any questions on this? Okay. That's it for today. If you want to, you've got about 7-ish minutes, 8 minutes. You can study for your test, which is on Wednesday.